This morning we continue this new series, that we started last week and are calling Differentiate, and it's a series that I'm very excited about. We begin to look at what is often called the Sermon on the Mount, and it's just these early teachings of Jesus that are recorded by Matthew that really tell us what will differentiate us in the world. Differentiate is this 7-week study through a collection of Jesus' teaching found in the book of Matthew that challenge, that remind, and equip us to live in a differentiated way in our neighborhoods and in our spheres of influence. Now, far too often, as I said last week, when we think of the word differentiate, or we think of the way that we are to be differentiated in the world, we automatically begin to think about isolation, that we need to be so different, that we need to isolate ourselves, that we need to pull ourselves out of the world, that we need to make sure we abandon the world and follow God. And this is what we normally begin to think about when we think of the word differentiate, or think about the way that Christians should be differentiated in the world. However, I think when we see in this, what we will see throughout this study and this series, is that Christians aren't supposed to isolate themselves. We weren't created to have our heads in the cloud and our feet on the earth. We were created to be in the here and the now as part of God's kingdom's mission. We're not to be isolated. We are not to act in abandonment. And we are to be differentiated, but every bit part of the everyday. I chose a foosball table, as I said last week, one of my favorite games to play when you're in a cabin or something like that, to highlight this idea, differentiate, to illustrate for this, because I think it gives us a much healthier image of what it means to be differentiated. All the players on a foosball table are in the same game. They will all wear the same uniform. They're all on the same playing field. They all play by the same rules. The only difference is some of the players are looking in a different way. They are playing for a different goal. And those things are really the only thing that differentiate them from everyone else. Looking in a different way. And we also know that they are playing for a different goal. This morning, as we continue to look at what it means for us to be differentiated, as we look at what it means to look at things a different way and to play for a different goal, we begin this second exploration into these first lessons from this collection of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. These teachings in which we are exploring in our series Differentiate are found early on in Matthew, and Matthew is a really unique storyteller, and he begins to really write about what he sees Jesus doing, what he sees Jesus saying, and more importantly, what he sees Jesus fulfilling. Now, Matthew goes on about this in his own unique way, through his own collection of stories, and he begins to develop a narrative of Jesus' teachings that are found like this in no other gospel or book. For Matthew, the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus becomes center stage. It becomes central to everything that he is. In Matthew's story, the crowds have become inspired by the teachings and the healings of Jesus. And they are beginning to kind of form around Jesus. And so, as any good rabbi or teacher would have done in his time, Jesus sees his natural amphitheater on the side of the mountain, and he calls the crowds and his disciples to follow him there. And it's there that he begins to teach these foundational truths, these foundational teachings on what it means to live as a follower of Jesus. And we might even say it's there that we see Jesus begin to give the kingdom's DNA. As we'll see, this is a teaching from Jesus that challenges us, it reminds us, and it equips us to live in a differentiated way. Now, N.T. Wright, a theologian, says about the chapter this, and I said it last week and I'm going to say it every week because I love this quote. Throughout this chapter, Jesus is not just giving moral commands, he's unveiling a whole new way of being human. We might play on the same field, we might play by the same rules, we might look like the other players in the game, but we are playing for a new way of being human. We are playing for a different stage, we are playing for a different goal, and we are playing in a different angle. That is what differentiates us from others. Simply put, Jesus is saying there's a new way to be human. There's a way to be differentiated. This morning we read from Matthew 5, 38 to 42. And as Jesus begins to talk to this crowd that is gathered on the mountainside on the topic of revenge and holding grudges, I invite you to follow along with me in your Bible or on the overhead screen. And like last week, I invite you to pay attention to where Jesus names what has been accepted culturally or what has been historically accurate for their people, and then illustrates it as something impossible for anyone to live up to, but then continues to raise the bar both for the cultural standard and our way of living. Now, Matthew 5, 38 through 42 reads like this. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek as well. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, then go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This passage, a passage that we may know, we may have encountered lots of times, or may not have read much at all. In this passage, there are some very important places that I think we need to pay attention to the text, to understand the overarching theme, the cultural understandings, but also what it means for us to be equipped to live in this better way, in this new way of being human. William Barclay, a theologian, writes this about the overarching theme. There are few passages in the New Testament which have more of the essence of the Christian ethic in them than this passage has. Here is the characteristic ethic of the Christian life, and the conduct which should distinguish or differentiate the Christian from all other men. William Barclay is saying this is it. If there's anything in the Bible that tells us what should distinguish us from everyone else, this is it. In essence, this is the Christian walk. That is how theologian William Barclay sees it. Now in this passage, we see Jesus begin to address something they culturally knew well. He says, you have heard it said, right? You've heard it said. You know this to be true. You know this is the standard by which we live by. It might even be called, what he quotes there, as the oldest law in humanity. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It wasn't just a Jewish concept. In Latin, the Roman Empire called it lex talionis. Babylon, right? When they overtake Judea, they also have the same kind of eye for an eye thinking, and they called theirs the code of Hammurabi. In the Muslim countries, we have qisus, eye for an eye, right? That is the Muhammad's teaching on it. We often refer to teaching on eye and eye, or even the right to revenge, or we might say it's tick for tack, blow for blow, or the right to make somebody feel the way, or let them know the way that we feel about what they did to us. It's the oldest law in the world, this eye for eye standard. It allows for somebody to be compensated for the loss of something. Now, throughout Leviticus, Exodus, and Deuteronomy, we find laws that call for an offender to compensate their victim, regardless if their offense was intentional or not, right? If you did something wrong, intentional or not, there was a way that you were to be paying compensation for that. Someone kills your animal, they should replace it. If someone takes someone's life, then they should give theirs. If someone blinds you in an eye, and this is where we get the eye for eye, they should give you their eye. At first glance, it may look like a harsh law, right? That's scary, right? If I unintentionally hurt somebody, I might have to really pay out. It looks like legal revenge. However, God gave them these strict rules to investigate, also in addition to this, any claim with great kind of guidelines, right? He told them there has to be more than 2 witnesses. It has to go before judges and priests, and they have to do an investigation. It wasn't like every little offense got to this point of eye for an eye. However, even with all that, it still feels heavy. The outcome was clearly a life for a life. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burning for a burning, a wound for a wound, and a stripe for a stripe. William Barclay says that let me say this first. These rules of living seem fair. They might seem harsh, but they do seem fair. Much more harsh than you and I might be okay with. And for that reason, there's been debates throughout time of to what severity and reality did they actually practice this? How much did they actually live these things out? And theologian William Barclay reflects. The lex talionis is far from being a savage and bloodthirsty law. So in other words, it's not as harsh as you tend to think of it. It is in fact the beginning of mercy. Its original aim was to definitely the limitation of vengeance. In the very earliest days, the vendetta and the blood feud were characteristic of tribal society. This law deliberately limits vengeance. Right? So we tend to think of it as a harsh law, but it's actually the beginning of mercy. You guys know what it's like to want to revenge on somebody. You don't want to stop where it's equal. You want them to really pay for that, right? You might sue them for this, but then you're going to also sue them for hardship on top of it, right? This is the same society. And so when we see this law being come into effect, it's really a protection. No, you don't get to sue them for everything they're worth. There's a limit, there's a standard to this. But even though we find it a tough law, most of us have some way or living or thinking by this. Most of us in this room and in our culture believe there should be some sort of required payback or compensation for the wrong of another. We live in a culture that sues over coffee being too hot. We live in a culture that fights on Facebook about our differences and then calls them offenses. In this, I'm sure many of us in the majority of this room have some part of their life or some point of their life been wronged, right? There's some point that you've been wronged by somebody in some capacity, and a result, you probably still hold a grudge, a hurt, or an anger towards them. With that, we hold this expectation that I'll let go of that grudge, I'll let go of that hurt, I'll let go of that anger when they make it right. When they make it right, I'll let go of that. I'll forgive them then. They've got to meet me now, right? We live in a culture that believes when somebody breaks our car, they should pay. When someone hurts someone, they should be persecuted. We carry extra insurances in case an uninsured driver damages something of ours and cannot afford to pay it. Even our president seems that this is a formula to live by. He says that his favorite book in the Bible, though he couldn't remember his favorite verse in the Bible, though he couldn't remember where it was that whole teaching on an eye for an eye. He wasn't referring to the one we just read. He was referring to the Exodus account. He says, though it's not a particularly nice thing, I see it happening all over our country. I mean, when you see what's going on in our country, how people are taking advantage of us in our country and how they scoff at us and laugh at us, well, there should be something learned from the Bible. What we and our president need to learn about this teaching of Jesus is that this way of living, even in the Old Testament, wasn't a vengeful one. It actually wasn't lived out in vengeance. It wasn't eye for an eye, like, okay, you hurt me, I'm coming for your eye now. It wasn't how it was practiced. William Barclay explained this quite well. This was never a law that gave a private individual the right to extra vengeance. It was always the law which laid down how to judge in the law court must assess punishment and penalty. Rabbi Ari Khan writes this: the connotation of an eye for an eye is that the punishment for removing an eye is that the perpetrator's eye will be put out. We should note that normative Jewish law has never interpreted this pronouncement in this way. Jewish law is unequivocal. No Jewish court ever sanctioned or implemented this method of corporal punishment. Taking an eye from the perpetrator would be an affront to Jewish law as practiced both in modern and ancient times. In other words, to actually live this law out undermines the law itself. He goes on, no authentic Jewish court ever meted out such punishment. Jewish law has always dictated monetary restitution, interpreting the Torah as having commanded the value of an eye in place of an eye. In other words, You took my eye. You will compensate me financially for that, but I don't literally get to poke your eye out with a stick. Though some of us might want to do that to someone we hold a grudge with. William Barclay agrees when he writes, this law was never, even in any semi-civilized society, carried out literally. The Jewish jurist argued rightly that to carry it out literally might in fact be the reverse of justice. It was a standard, it was a value, it was a way of living, a way of measuring, but it was not a literal legal vengeance. Even enforcing leaders in this, the leaders of the law saw value that if they would do this, it would actually undermine its intent. We must not assume that revenge was ever the intent of these laws in which Jesus is addressing. Now, we live in a culture that sees those words, it doesn't understand what was being said there, and usually this is one of the first things. So you believe a God that says it's paid to do that? Right? We must never assume that this was just also the culture of the Old Testament. There's some of us that would say, well, in the Old Testament, it was okay to do those things, but it's not anymore. No, it was never okay. It was a standard. Because around those same verses that we see Jesus quoting from Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy are also these higher Levitical laws. Laws that say, you must never avenge somebody or have a grudge. There are also laws in that same next chapter that say we must serve and even feed our enemy. These are higher laws of mercy that hold these other ones in both meaning and tension. There's a theme of abundant mercy that actually equally flows throughout the Old Testament. We might applaud ourselves, by the way, for never taking revenge. You might be beginning to think of the places that you have lived this out well. Well, that guy hit my car and I never made him pay for it, so I'm feeling pretty good about myself. But these higher Levitical laws that are around this testament that Jesus is talking about also tell us to never hold a grudge. To never hold a grudge. Now, how many of us can applaud ourselves in never holding a grudge? I can't. Can you? Can you really say you've never held a grudge? But what Jesus is referencing here is actually calling people back to those higher Levitical laws. That personal approach to eye for an eye is exactly what Jesus is getting at. This eye for an eye stuff of the Old Testament was a legal court standard. The standard by which we lived as individuals was not that. You were to love your enemy, to never hold a grudge. Man, it changes what we are to live out. Justice was always the discernment of the judges. But at the time of Jesus, many have pointed out, historians, theologians, many have pointed out that rabbinic practice was allowing people to interpret these ways of living to vengefully seek compensation from offenders for personal offense. In other words, rabbis had found a way to excuse people having grudges. Not allowed to have grudges, but it's an eye for an eye. All of a sudden, Jesus shows up. People are holding personal grudges. New Testament scholar Michael J. Wilkins comments, what Jesus counteracts is the way the law of retaliation was now being used or was used to excuse personal retribution. Getting even with somebody. This is what Jesus becomes upset at. The grudges that were taking root legally in people's hearts. As the Layman Bible's commentary explains, Jesus was therefore not protesting against any current abuse, but rather dealing with a law regarded as legitimate. So in other words, nobody was really poking each other's eye out, but what it had done is called into question the name of a higher justice. The justice which governs the sons of the Father who is in heaven. Right? He calls them to his own standard. He goes on to say, the world of Jesus' day was under the law of retaliation. We probably also live under a law of retaliation. All laws required that the wrongdoer should get as good as he gave. Make him feel it. In Jesus' time, the equivalent in money was extracted in compensation for an injury, but it placed restraints on private retaliation or clan vengeance. Now, in this passage, Jesus is already becoming obviously concerned with where the heart of his followers are. Those people that are on the mountainside with him, he wants to see what is being harbored in the hearts of those who are about to follow him. And as he teaches these earliest crowds on the mountainside, as he teaches you and me from the mountainside, Jesus begins to introduce a new law, a law of the kingdom. I love how the Interpreter's Bible commentary says it. He says, the law of the kingdom, this thing Jesus is introducing, took direct issue with it. Jesus here proposes a gentle revolution. The law of the kingdom took direct issue with it. Jesus here proposes a gentle revolution. Jesus proclaimed that his kingdom was now in their midst. It was something that was fulfilled but not consummated. It was enacted but not yet in full role. Yet we, his followers, are to live into the kingdom. They are to live as if it's here. They are to live into the laws and the values of the kingdom as taught by Jesus. These laws and values will cause a gentle revolution in the way that we live in the world. N.T. Wright explains it like this. Jesus offers a new sort of justice, a creative, healing, restorative justice. The old justice found in the Bible was designed to prevent revenge from running away with itself. But Jesus goes one better still. Better to have no vengeance at all, but rather a creative way forward, redirecting the astonishing patient love of God himself, who wants Israel to shine his light into the world so that all people will see that he is the one true God and that his deepest nature is overflowing with love. No other God encourages people to behave like this. This is the part that is the quiet revolution. This passage differentiates what's different about us than everyone else in the world. I love how Jesus raises the bar here. We looked at how it's been in every culture since the beginning of time. But Jesus, N.T. Wright says, proves that no other, and calls us to live a way that no other God encourages people to behave like this. That's differentiation. Jesus' followers had lived in a very oppressive time. Rome taxed them more than they could afford. And when they couldn't afford their taxes, Rome would come in and take their stuff. Sometimes even their family members, daughters, sons, and enslave them. When the top of that, there was still religious and temple taxes to pay and tithes. There was still the cost of everyday living, and the world was increasingly polarized between the haves and the have-nots. And on top of that, people were just trying to find a way to live. There was just trying to find a way to survive. Now, their culture didn't allow them to have loans and to give loans, but man, they had no way of making money, so they tried to loan things to each other at an interest, and they tried to make a buck off each other wherever they could. It's very similar to our old culture. People were using each other in their miserableness and in their vulnerability. When you get burnt in a deal like that, you want to make it right. They should have been making the deals in the beginning. Well, they wanted to find ways to embarrass each other for their trespasses so they could spit at each other when they'd walk by the street sometimes. Right? Then there was this other thing where you were permitted not to full on slap somebody, but you could take your hand and you could backhand somebody in the right side of their face with your good side. You know, is this my good side? You're taking a picture of it's your right side usually, right? They were allowed to take their hand and slap them in public as a way of embarrassing them that this person was bad. I'm holding a grudge. This is how I'm dealing with it. In public, I'm going to slap you. You could legally get to court and you could petition the court to get somebody's coat given to you. Now, coat was a sign of honor as you walked around, but at night, in a culture like this, it was also your blanket. Man, that would really make somebody, the way they made me feel, I'm going to get their coat, right? Because now they're going to walk around, everyone's going to look at them and say, wow, that guy doesn't have a coat, and they're going to know that person, he's evil, and he's paying back for something he did. And at night when he's laying, and he doesn't have a blanket, I know he's going to be thinking about how he wronged me. Now, there were other people that just felt downtrodden by life and the empire, the rich. They were seemingly unfairly downtrodden under life, and they began to feel like life just really owed them something. And they wanted to make a buck off anybody where they could because, I've been so burned, I just want to make something happen for me. Then after all, there was these soldiers and rich people that could force you to do things. Soldiers could take daughters. Roman soldiers could even force you to come and to make you carry their stuff, their shields, their swords on the Roman road. And they would make you do it, and then they'd steal somebody else from the town and make them carry it. And they would have to carry these heavy weapons and equipment. It was belittling and sad. It was embarrassing. Somebody had to pay for this offense. Life has done me wrong. I am holding a grudge about that. And the rabbis had found ways to make this stuff right. Jesus' quiet revolution changes all of this. Ironically, the nature of Jesus' teaching is through the lens, by the way, as we read, of the wrongdoer, as if the Christians are the ones doing the trespasses. We shouldn't resist someone when they seem to want to harm us for evil reasons. There should be no grudges, no fighting back, no resistance. In fact, if we are slapped on the cheek for any reason, we should turn and give them the other cheek as well. If anyone wants to sue us for any reason, then we should quickly give them what they want and more. You want my coat? How about I give you my shirt as well? Right? If anyone wants to sue us, we should give them more. If anyone even wants, like a despicable Roman soldier forces us to walk a mile, then we should offer to go 2 miles with them. We should find ways to bless our enemy. We should find ways to, if we have to walk 2 miles, then we are not going to see another Jewish person get hurt in this process. We are going to be the bearer of that. We should allow our money and time, Jesus is saying, to be used by those who look to take advantage of us. They were to live by mercy, by these higher Levitical laws that we looked at. They were not to even hold a grudge. There's no personal revenge. There's no eye for an eye. There's no making somebody feel the way you feel. There's only mercy, no grudge. So what do we do about it? Theologian F.F. Bruce writes, any and every effort to explain these verses in terms of law is bound to fail. We are simply given a picture of how the regenerate, the followers of Jesus, the differentiated, will behave if they respond to their new nature. He goes on, the Sermon on the Mount isn't just about us. If it was, we might admire as a bit of idealism, right? Well, Jesus said a really great ideal, but then we'd return to our normal lives. It's about Jesus himself. This was a blueprint for his own life. He asks nothing of his followers that he hasn't faced himself. Now, there are 4 quick takeaways that I think we take from this passage. One is Jesus points out that while the law of the land may permit compensation for pain and suffering, he desires an even greater standard for his followers. It might be what every culture has survived on from day one, but guys, I want more of you. The law of the kingdom, the one I'm introducing to you, Jesus says, is that we are not to seek vengeful compensation when someone wrongs us, but rather offer them mercy and servitude. Pay attention to those higher Levitical laws, right? I want you to never seek vengeful compensation for when someone wrongs you. And in fact, if somebody wrongs you, go over the top and pour more blessing on them. Jesus explains that mercy and servitude should even allow persecutors to take advantage of our pain, time, money, stuff, and patience. None of us like to be taken advantage of. That could be perhaps when we feel the most grudges, when a store charges us too much, when a friend takes too much of our time, somebody calls us when we're sleeping, or someone takes advantage of something we've lent them, right? These things are what cause us to hold the most personal grudges. When you lend a lawnmower, it comes back broken, right? But what happens here is Jesus says that those persecutors should be allowed to take advantage of our pain, our time, our money, our stuff, and our patience. In a roundabout way, Jesus calls his followers to come off that mountainside. When he's done teaching, when you come off this mountainside, you're upholding a higher Levitical law, that call for a transformed heart that knows no harboring of grudge or offense. When we leave this place, Live into your new regenerate nature. A new way, as N.T. Wright says, to be human. A new way to be differentiated. You don't know any harboring of a grudge or offense. That is what it means to be my follower. Menno Simons, a foundational father of our church movement, after reflecting on this passage, writes, "Behold, these are the words of Christ. All those now who are his sheep will hear his voice." The Old Testament gave us a standard, a way of living that valued mercy and justice. Jesus reminds us that we should follow those higher Levitical laws, that we should have no personal grudge or offense. We shouldn't seek compensation, but kind of give servitude and surrender. And this isn't idealism. This is our new nature. It's the new way to be human, to be differentiated. To quote Menno Simons again, "True Christians know of no vengeance, however they might be wrong. In patience, they possess their souls. They do not break the peace, even if they should be tempted by bondage, torture, poverty, sword of life. They do not cry for vengeance, as does the world." In this time of early Anabaptists that are being killed for their faith, he's saying even when they face bondage, torture, poverty, and the sword of life, they hold no grudge. Jesus gave us a quiet revolution that will differentiate us. The last thing I have for you this morning is in 130 AD, there's this guy named Matthias. He goes by the name Matthias. We don't know his real name. It literally just means disciple. He named himself disciple, right? And he's writing to Diognetus about this defense of Christianity. Now listen to how he explains how Christians are living in this time. And may it ring true of you and I. "For the Christians are distinguished from other men, neither by country nor language, nor the customs they observe," right? We don't look or smell any different. "For they neither inhabit cities of their own." In other words, we're not isolated, "nor employ a peculiar form of speech. We don't speak Christianese, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity." There's not one thing that sets us apart. "The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves advocates of any merely human doctrines. But inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them are determined, and following the customs and natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life." Now, what is that thing that he's about to say is going to set them different? They dwell in their own country simply as sojourners, as citizens. They share all things with others, and yet endure all things as if they are foreigners. They live as if they are strangers in their land, not as they are citizens. Every foreign land to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry as do all. They have children. They do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth. They are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time surpass the laws of their lives. They love all men. They are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. But despite all of that, despite that they are poor, yet they make rich, they are in lack of, and yet are in lack of all things, and yet abound in all, they are dishonored. Now here's the part we need to pay attention to. They are dishonored, and yet their very dishonor, they are glorified. In their dishonor, in their persecution, they are still glorified. They are evilly spoken of, and yet they are justified. They are reviled and blessed. They are insulted, and they repay insult with honor. They do good, yet they're punished as evildoers. And when punished, they rejoice as if they are quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners. They are persecuted by the Greeks, yet who hate them and are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. In 130 AD, Matthias realizes that what sets Christians apart, what differentiates them, is this new way of being human. That when somebody persecutes them, they take no offense. They bless. And they aren't caught up in the world they live in, even though they live as normal citizens in it. They live as if they are strangers in it. They understood what Jesus was teaching on that mountain. Do we? Do we get that? As the worship team comes forward, I wonder if we've allowed God to differentiate us from the law of the world or the law of the land, and now given us the law of the kingdom. Where do you still hold grudges? Think about that as we worship. Where do you still hold grudges? Where do you seek something to be made right for you?